My writing focus for today is desolation versus emptiness. In post apocalyptic settings, there is a fine balance between creating a world that is empty versus desolate. What I mean by that is an empty setting means that it feels very lifeless. And while a post apocalyptic setting is going to be quote unquote lifeless or very devoid of life, you don't want to get into a situation where it's boring because ultimately we're here to entertain the reader, or in this case, the gamer, the viewer, and so on. You want the reader to feel that they're in an open wasteland, but if it's a sandbox with no toys, it's boring. If you've ever played an open world game like this, you might get this characteristic. It feels very open and empty and lifeless. It needs to be filled with something, whether that be creatures, buildings to look at, or people. So one of the challenges that I noticed when writing my series, especially the first novel, is trying to create this balance. I wanted it to feel like a desert wasteland, but without any discernible features, it just would feel very lifeless and ultimately boring. So I thought of some flora and fauna that I could put into my series that would make it a little bit more full of life. For example, I thought about a desert reptile, and I thought about what would happen to a desert reptile if it was irradiated. What would it look like? How would it mutate? How would it survive in these conditions? Well, it would become more brutal, at least in my opinion. So I gave it a set of horizontal as well as vertical teeth, 6 legs instead of 4, and the ability to dig and wait for prey similar to a trapdoor spider. These ideas gave birth to the Gon, which I then sprinkle in here and there either as part of the landscape or as a direct threat to the characters. Another thing that I noticed while trying to write the series, and that I continue to work through to this day, is the fact that I don't want to go the other direction and over-describe every single aspect of the landscape. This is actually something I learned the hard way after going through my drafts. Sometimes I really wanted the reader to know every single tiny detail that the main characters were seeing. But what ended up happening is this sort of, I'm going to call it the uncanny valley of writing effect. And what I mean by that is when over-description becomes more confusing than helpful. It's like the details are so on the nose that it becomes a blender of description. As I've written, and this continues to be something I practice to this day, I don't want to over-describe and give this quote-unquote uncanny valley effect. In other words, less is more. You want to give the tone and the broad strokes of what is happening, but you don't want to make the reader feel every single inch of the scene. You'd rather have the reader create the picture in their mind. And that's what happens sometimes when people are reading the same book. Two readers can come up with slightly different interpretations while still getting the scene in their head. I'll give you an example of something that is overwriting and over-describing. This is an example that I wrote, but this is also based off of what I've read in other books. The 6'6" tall man with a brown hat had 5 stains on it. As he moved past the purple and green floral patterned tablecloth, his hazel eyes scanned the 10 by 10-foot room. A black cabinet with 3 drawers stood in one corner. The middle drawer opened to reveal 6 sheets of paper. In the other corner, a multi-layered stand had 7 picture frames on it. Families with 3 kids in each. Confusing? Are your eyes glazing over? I know mine were, and I was the one who wrote it. It becomes too much clutter in the reader's mind, and they have too many things to try and keep track of. The reason I bring this up is because I'm guilty of doing this myself. I wanted the reader to know every single inch of that room in this example, but then I realized that by the time the reader gets to the end of that paragraph, chances are they're going to have to go back to the top of the paragraph just to get all of those details again. And what was the point of those details? They're completely unnecessary. Now, this is something that actually happened in Victorian literature where there are some authors that wanted to talk about how the wallpaper came from, a certain place in another country 14 years ago. And there's a description of every single aspect of the house that they're in. But going on for 4 or 5 paragraphs about the wallpaper isn't endearing or cute anymore. Just get to the point. So what I did is then I edited it and I decided that I'm going to take out some details and try and shorten it so that you still get a similar picture without it being overly cluttered. Ready? The tall man wore a brown stained hat. He passed the floral tablecloth, his hazel eyes scanning the black cabinet, one drawer ajar. He turned to the picture frames on the tiered stand to examine the families. Now, that is not the only way to edit that paragraph, and you may have thought of different ways to edit it yourself, and that's the beauty of writing. But that's the point I'm trying to make. Just get to the point, or the readers will stop reading. At the very least, they begin skimming, and all of that hard work that you just did over describing everything gets lost. So, if you're a writer, what have you learned about landscape descriptions? Or what have you learned about descriptions in general? I hope this has helped. And if you played Fallout 3, what's your opinion of it? While you're at it, check out my novel series, A Spark in the Ashes, with Book 1, The Vital Link, in all major and minor outlets. And keep an eye out for Novel 2. Just remember, war.
War never changes.